All right. So, welcome to the Sunday chat. Today, Martin has asked a question and may have caught me out on something, uh, asking about is samadhi a factor of the first jhana? Well, first off, we need to define what is first jhana and what is samadhi, and then we can see about the factor. So, the first point is that the word samadhi in Buddhism actually does not mean what is often translated to be the word concentration, but rather it means how the mind is organized. So if the mind is in fact organized, or another word we can use would be unified, or let us say then that the thoughts, one after another, are congruent. If the thoughts, one after another, the thoughts are congruent with one another, then that would be considered a samadhi mind, as opposed to a scattered mind, which means we think about this, we think about that, we go back to the first thing, we're off to the third, and the mind is jumping around. That often happens when we're confused and we start looking for various answers to a question that is more of a feeling or a state of mind than it is a question that can be stated in a sentence. Another time when the mind is disorganized is when we don't like, let us say something, and we're trying to make up an answer, all right, that we're looking for something. And an example of that would be then, so if we tell a lie, the lie that we tell keeps us from being congruent or whole. Why? Because the lie that we tell is then separated from the truth. So there's many different times and occasions when the mind is not organized. I would also say that that's the standard state that most people are in most of the time. Another example of the disjointed mind would be when we're in a dialogue with each other, or not each other, but within one's own mind. The dialogue would be something like, oh, you ought to lose weight. And then, I don't want to lose weight. Or, oh, you ought to go do this or that. Another example, this is really an interesting one, that you have the sensation or feeling that you need to go to the toilet, but you don't want to go to the toilet because you're busy doing something else. Okay? That's a disjointed mind. But a samadhi mind would be when you have the urge to go to the toilet, you go to the toilet. That's a congruent position. Okay, does that make sense, David? That we're talking about when the mind is organized or congruent. This is a samadhi mind. When it can have one wholesome thought after another after another. Actually, we need to add that quality to it, that a samadhi mind has thoughts that are wholesome. They also would be real, like looking at what's real as opposed to dreaming something up. So we could say then that a samadhi mind is very close to reality, and a disjointed mind is not liking reality and wanting it to be something else and maybe making something else, making up a story, etc., like this. Now, in Thailand, they use the word samadhi as an exchange for the word that in English would be used for meditation. And yet when someone is, let us say, a Westerner who is practicing meditation, is often not in a samadhi mind, that in fact a good reason to have a practice of meditation is to practice getting the mind into a samadhi mind. That would be the use of a meditation practice, is to get the mind in a congruent state, which means that now we're no longer having unwholesome thoughts about, oh, this is bad, and oh, that's bad, and oh, I'm poor me, and all of this kind of stuff. But practicing anapanasati, or practicing meditation, so that we can get the mind in a wholesome state, one wholesome thought after another after another. Now, there is a lot of examples that we can, from the suttas and the old literature, that we can point to. One of them is the example of a yurt. Now, the yurt is a tent that's used in Mongolia still today, but they were common in the old days because it was a substantial building that was also temporary. And the important quality of a yurt is that it has a center ridgepole. You could say that the same thing is even true of most modern tents. But another example would be a Native American teepee or wigwam. And how those are built is they have long, long sticks or logs, let us say 20 feet long and maybe a couple of inches round, a young tree. Now, if you have just a whole pile of those logs, they're not samadhi. If you put up a tent, they'll all fall down unless you take and tie all of those logs into a bundle at one end and then stretch them out. So a child's teepee would have 4, but they would a big one would have as many as, say, 20 of these all going around, but they meet at the top. The same thing is true with a yurt, that it has a center ridgepole, but from that center ridgepole, all of the other poles are around it that come down to the main part of the tent and then go straight down. And the samadhi point is where all of the poles in that center meet. This was the original word use for the word of samadhi, is when everything comes together at one point. So you could actually then say that when you figure something out, when things come together, then you feel satisfied. An example of that is that you're working on a website, because Kobe and I are working on a website, and we've got 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 issues that need to be solved. And when all of them come together, almost all on the same day, and we've gotten all the problems solved, then the mind that's dealing with all those problems feels complete. It feels whole. It feels centered. So this is the way that we're looking at a samadhi mind, is one that's organized and unified, which actually means also it has the quality of satisfaction, because if we're dissatisfied, then that's kind of a disunity. Does anybody have any questions about this?
I have one question.
Yes.
So there is also a term samta, I think, used for meditation, samta meditation. Is
Samatha.
samta and samadhi, they are related, or?
Yes, the word samadhi and the word samatha are closely related. The word samatha actually is used in the suttas, and what the word samatha means is that once the mind is organized, it becomes settled. Okay, so the word samatha actually means settled. And another word that we could use for it would be relaxed. And so you can see how the word samatha and the word samadhi are very closely related. They're used in different contexts, but they basically mean the same thing. All right. Now, there is, let us say, after the time of the Buddha, there became a discussion about samatha versus vipassana. Now, vipassana actually is not a word used often in the suttas, but the word samatha does appear. And so what the word vipassana means is that we can look clearly, we can see clearly. Now, it's translated into the word insight, and that in Western terminology, we get the idea that it means, aha, now I can see it. Like before we couldn't see it, and now we can see it. And basically what we're using that for is, aha, before I could not see the dukkha, but now I can see it. That's the best use for the word vipassana. Well, let's use an example of a camera. That if you have your cell phone camera, and let us say that you're having a video here, every one of you, I can tell, has the camera that's fairly stable because I can see the image. But if you are walking around with your cell phone, the image will jiggle around, right? And your face will move up and down on the screen, or if a big event comes in, if somebody tries to grab the cell phone from you, then the cell phone, it's really hard to see what's going on. For instance, a cop is wearing a video camera and gets into a tussle with someone on the street, then the video of that tussle is useless. We can't really see what's going on. So this is what we mean then by insight is that the mind then is stable enough that it can see clearly. We actually sometimes use a camera. In the old days, we had to keep the lens open a long time because the silver nitrate panel was not very sensitive. And that would give a blurry image if you held the camera. So you would put it on a tripod. Also, if you're looking at something from a great distance, a zoom, you would need the camera on a tripod in order to get a stable image. That stability then is the samatha, so that we can see the image clearly, the vipassana. When the camera is stable, samatha, when the mind is stable, samatha, then the reality can be seen clearly, the vipassana. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
All right. So these are three words that we've got together, and they're all three interrelated with one another. Now, there is a sutta that says, this is in the Anguttara Nikaya, and the sutta says that if a student has vipassana, but they do not have samatha, then instead of continuing practicing vipassana, the sutta recommends that you stop doing that and start developing samatha. If you have samatha but do not have vipassana, then it would say to stop developing samatha and start developing vipassana. And then in the third case, that if the student doesn't have either vipassana or samatha, then they should be developed together. And that's basically the way that Westerners should practice, is to practice both vipassana and samatha together. So now let's go to the point of the jhanas, especially the first jhana. Now, we do spend a lot of time talking about the first jhana, and we also, as a practitioner, should be spending our time practicing getting into and staying in the first jhana. And so let's investigate the various aspects of the first jhana. The first one is that the mind is free from hindrances. And what that means is that the mind is in a wholesome state and the thoughts are wholesome thoughts. Now, we can practice that intentionally, having a wholesome thought and a wholesome thought, and then we'll have a thought of someplace else, some other time, maybe some people, and then we come back again and practice having the mind in that wholesome state, one wholesome thought after another. This is meaning the mind is free from hindrances. And so, David, you can see immediately then that if the mind is not wandering away, but it's staying stable, it's got both the qualities of samadhi and the quality of samatha built into it. All right. Now, in Sutta number 19 in the Majjhima Nikaya, there is a story where the Buddha says about a cowherd. This is one of my favorite stories. And that is the cowherd, not like a cowboy that has a droving of 1,000 cows or whatever, but just a cowherd in India in the old days, where one guy has half a dozen cows, and he has to take them out for grazing. But in order to get them out to the grazing place, they have to pass through the village. He's got them possibly in his in a corral at his house, and he has to take them out of the corral and get them out to the field where they can graze. And along the way, they are having to deal with the villagers in the village. And so the cowherd will take a stick, a walking stick, a pole, maybe 4, 5, or 6 feet long. And if one of the cows grabs a carrot off of the table of one of the salesmen that is out selling his carrots on the table, then the cowherd will whack that cow with that stick. And in fact, I have another example of that, and that is that when I'm eating food, the puppy will come and put her head in the bowl to try to get the food out while I'm having lunch, and I'll whack that puppy to get it back out of the bowl. All right? That's the analogy then, is when the mind wanders away into unwholesome thoughts, we will whack the mind with our mental stick and say, aha, I caught you. You can't have that bowl. You can't have that carrot. You can't have that unwholesome thought. And we begin to whack the mind to get it in line so that we can move along. Now, in the story, after the cowherd gets the cows out to pasture, they will be grazing, their heads will be down, and now the cowherd doesn't have to stand there and whack the cows. Then, in fact, he can just move under a tree and sit down and keep his eye on those cows. All right, so that's what we mean then, is that once the anapanasati practice is being successful, that we can sit there and have one wholesome thought after another. And the cows are gaining the value of being able to graze properly, and the cowherd is gaining the value of taking a rest. He doesn't have to be on guard so much. So this is the analogy then, is that the beginner has to whack the mind to get it to back into a wholesome state over and over and over again. But once the mind comes to the state of having one wholesome thought after another, then that would be called a mind free from hindrances or free from obstructions. So we're actually going in the direction of having a samadhi mind, as well as going in the direction of having a samatha mind. But that's only one of the factors. Go ahead, Emmerich.
So here actually, in this analogy of the cows and the cow herd, when we apply it to mind, so this means one part of a mind is a cow herd, and then there are several other parts of the mind which are like cows, right? So mind is in the Buddhist description, mind is anyway, there are many minds. There's not one.
Right, exactly. Well, basically what that means is that let's imagine that the mind is like a toy factory. And it produces this kind of toy for a minute, and then those kind of toys for a minute, and then another kind of toy for a minute, and it keeps manufacturing various toys. So let's make sure that we're defining mind correctly. It's not the manufactured toys, but rather the manufacturing position or the process. Okay? So in this regard, the manufacturing process is both the cows and the stick and the cow herd and the environment. And that when the cows are then out grazing, then the mind can take a rest. It doesn't have to be quite so on guard. So with the other factors of the jhana, the first jhana, that's the first one that we've talked about. The second one is that when the cow herd can sit and rest a bit, then he is in a state of sukha, which means that he is, let us say, content. Let us say he's also not in fear, that he feels safe and secure because he's gotten the cows out of the village. So long as he is in the village, which means so long as a meditator is having mind thoughts that are scattered from here to there, he has to be on guard to make sure that those thoughts come back into the wholesome state. And in a way, we kind of whack the mind to say, no, you can't go there. You have to stay in these wholesome states. All right? So, in order to get there, there's another quality of the first jhana that's called applying the mind. And the way that we would talk about applying the mind would be to whack that mind. That's the whacking process, that we keep applying it until we get it wholesome. Once we get it into the cow herd gets the cows out to the pasture, now we want to sustain those. In other words, once we've got wholesome thoughts going, we want to sustain those wholesome thoughts. Now, if we can apply and sustain the mind into the wholesome over and over again, it develops the feeling of safety, security, contentment, and satisfaction.
Sorry, Dhammarato.
Yes.
Can you explain more what is the difference between applying the mind in the wholesome and sustaining the mind in the wholesome?
All right. The applying of the mind means that at any moment, the mind is capable of wandering away. The beginner is like that. Just like the cow herd, that when the cows are still in the village, they're capable at any moment to do something wrong, to step on a child, or to grab a carrot or some groceries, or perhaps run amok and destroy the laundry, go into somebody's house. There's all kinds of dangers that those cows can do. And if they do those things, then the villagers will want reparations. They may take his cows away from him because he's not able to control them. Okay? So his job is to make sure that those cows are not doing damage while he's trying to get them out of the village into the pasture. That's the applying of the mind. Once we have the cows out of the village into the pasture, we want to keep them there. We want to sustain those wholesome thoughts until we have one wholesome thought after another, which is basically a very restful, peaceful place to where applying the mind and whacking those thoughts and getting them in line, that's not a very peaceful state to be in, but it's where we get started. So we start by applying the mind, and then when we get it to the point where there's one wholesome thought after another, we can sustain the mind. Now, within the practice of Anapanasati, we bring the breath into that because we want to investigate the body, and we do that in order to get the body to relax. So that's an actual, another factor of the first jhana is relaxed. So we have the removal of the hindrances. We have the practice of getting into a wholesome state by applying and sustaining the mind. And then the last jhana factor that we bring in is called in the Pali the word sukha, or excuse me, the word piti. And what the word piti means is the feeling of satisfaction, of success. In other words, the cow herd has now gotten the cows out into the pasture. They're grazing properly. Wow, what a relief it is. I didn't lose any of the cows. They didn't do any damage. And so he can sit down under a tree and keep an eye on the cows, but he doesn't have to be standing there with the cows whacking them anymore. So in fact, now we have 6 factors of the first jhana at play. We have number 1, the removal of the hindrances, removal of unwholesome thoughts. We apply the mind to do that until it can do it, and then we sustain that, and then we begin to be satisfied that we can do this. Then we become peaceful and serene, and then we become, wow, the feeling of satisfaction, I can do this. Now, in this regard, here we have now the quality of the body being relaxed and the mind in wholesome state. This is actually now the mind that's ready to do vipassana. The mind is ready to do vipassana once the mind is steady and stable, except for, ta-da, we needed vipassana all along in order to whack the mind to get it into the wholesome state. So in fact, in a way, it's almost impossible to do samatha meditation without doing vipassana, and it's also impossible or useless to do vipassana without gaining the stability of the samatha. And once we have both of those, then we can say that that's where the mind becomes a state of samadhi. So in fact, David, if you heard me say that samadhi and the first jhana, or the first jhana is not samadhi, we can say that, well, it is, but we can actually come to the point that when we have one wholesome thought after another wholesome thought, then we can begin to put some gaps in there. We could go so far as to say that now the cow herd does not have to be on such a vigil that he can actually, let's say, trust his cows that they will stay in the pasture. And so we can begin to put some gaps in those wholesome thoughts. Now, normally what happens with the students who are practicing first jhana, and they get a little of the satisfaction, they get some of the factors of first jhana, they immediately want to go and stop the mind. Well, they're not ready to do that. And what will happen is that they'll have a wholesome thought and a wholesome thought and then a gap and then an unwholesome thought. We want to make sure that when we have a wholesome thought and a wholesome thought, that the gap will then come back to the wholesome thought. And so we begin to play with let us say the fruit of the first jhana and the path of the second jhana is a gray area where we can have a little bit of gaps in the thought, and then come back into the wholesome, and then have another little gap, and then the wholesome, and then a longer gap, and then the wholesome. All right? But the Buddha actually says that no, this is just what the mind will do when it's well trained. That the real practice is that if you can get yourself into a state of satisfaction, into the state of sukha, and maintain that state of satisfaction and sukha, that is the entire teaching of the Buddha. Remember that the Buddha only teaches one thing, and that is dukkha, dukkha nirodha. So the first jhana, when it's fully developed, is a state of dukkha nirodha. Because why? Because you're satisfied. You're not in a state of dissatisfaction. So this is the way that we want to practice is to get the mind into one wholesome thought after another wholesome thought, become satisfied that the mind is doing that, become relaxed, have samatha, and then we have those wow states. Wow, this feels really nice. So then the second jhana would be that we stop looking at the mind itself and start paying more attention to how we feel. The second jhana is actually an experiential place where we're actually experiencing how good we feel. And the first jhana is getting ourselves into the state of feeling really good and being able to sustain it so that you feel sustained, you feel good time after time after time. Now, once the mind is really steady that way, now we can begin to see what it was that keeps us in the ordinary state. So here's where the Vipassana comes in. Now, in order to talk about that, I want to mention something, and that is that this practice is very simple. It's very easy to do, but it becomes complicated by all of the various unwholesome places the mind can go. And almost always questions that students come to me with have to do with the quality of, well, what about this and what about that? But if they would be correct, they'd say, what about this hindrance and what about this obstruction and what about this unwholesome thought? All right. So yesterday, Anna was asking the question about compassion. And it turns out that the people that she wants to show compassion to are not there. In fact, she's in New York and they're in Eastern Europe. And she wants to give them compassion. The answer is that desire to give them compassion is keeping you from being in a good, wholesome state right now. Desiring compassion. Or another one would be desiring desirelessness. Oh, I want to be in a state of desirelessness is actually a desire. Rather than recognizing it through Vipassana, oh, wanting to be compassionate is an unwholesome state to be in. Let me be satisfied, and when I become really satisfied, then the compassion for others will grow. So this is a talk on this issue of samadhi with its two friends, samatha and vipassana. And the vipassana is to recognize anything that's not right here, right now, is probably unwholesome. It's something that we're worried about. It's something that we're doubtful about. It's something that's making us restless. And so we have to have the insight into that to note that, oh, I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to figure that out. I don't have to go do that research. I don't have to do anything other than sit here and just be content, be satisfied, be at a state of rest. Don't have to get anything done, no place to go, nothing to do. Wow, what a relief it is. Everything's okay. No place to go, nothing to do. The spring comes and the grass grows all by itself. Yes, David. You have what you got on?
No, yeah, I just resonate with how you're talking about that and explaining that. I have a question about the applying and sustaining. Is that actually during the Suan Mok retreat I read a book. It was based on some talks by Buddhadasa. He said actually the applying has to do with applying the mind to the nimitta. Curiously, he was speaking
but we
about,
have,
yeah.
all right, let's make sure that we understand what the word nimitta means. Okay? The nimitta is actually a mental sign. Let me give you an example of the very, very old original use of the word nimitta. Is that there was a meditation practice in India in the ancient times where people would try to memorize an image. An example of that is taking like a mud pie. They would take mud and put it into a circle and let it dry. And then they would look at that nimitta, or they would look at that sign and then close their eyes and try to reimagine it exactly the way that it was. And then they'd open their eyes and see that it wasn't exactly right, and then they would put it back. Okay? So you could say then that the nimitta would be like writing the code that actually works. Another example would be of a nimitta. Have you ever heard of the word mandala? Do you know what a sand mandala is?
Yeah, it's a graphic image.
Mm-hmm. The Tibetan monks would practice this, all right? They have already memorized what that mandala is going to look like. And they have 5 or 6 buckets of sand of various colors, and more than one monk can sit there, and the several monks can draw this mandala because they know exactly what it looks like. In other words, they have a nimitta remembered in their mind. So the nimitta is a mental image, and that we can develop various ones. So let us talk about the nimitta in the respect of a meditation object. That the meditation object, let us say a good meditation object would be the body itself or parts of the body. So if you're looking at one particular part of the body, the example would be that when you're breathing out and paying attention to what's happening in the feeling area of that out-breath, then after the out-breath is finished, you can still experience the feeling that you had as the air was actually moving across. In other words, the nimitta is the development of the memory of exactly what it was that you were experiencing. So when those guys are doing that mandala, they'll probably have students standing around so that the students are memorizing the mandala and the way that it's built, so that next time when they're part of the team that's actually doing the mandala, they don't screw up. They don't put sand in the wrong place. Okay? So we can then apply this word nimitta to many different quartz. That in fact, Anapanasati has 16 steps, which means that we can have 16 different nimittas, or we can actually have 16 objects of meditation, And when we are observing that object of meditation, then we can kind of remember exactly what it was like. And so this is how we develop the nimitta. It's not having the nimitta that's the great advantage. It's the fact that we can develop the nimitta, which means you're really paying close attention to what's going on. And when we're really paying attention, for instance, to those thoughts, then wholesome thoughts would become a nimitta. Relaxation of the body would become a nimitta. Does that help you to understand it at fundamental level? Because then you can apply the idea of the nimitta, and an example of that would be being able to experience the out-breath as it's coming out of the body, and then when the out-breath is finished, you continue to focus on exactly what it felt like. Here's an example of that is that I can take and touch the palm of my hand with my finger, rub it around, and then remove the finger and still feel that sensation of the rubbing. Try it now. Okay, everybody do this. Get your hand up, rub the center part of the hand, and feel what that feels like. And now take the finger away from it and remember that sensation. Keep experiencing that touch. You can do it for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, and if you're good, you can continue that nimitta for half a minute or more. Yes, Amrit, that was good. You went back and did it again to renew it, okay? And when you bring it again, you can feel it again, okay? That's the development of the nimitta, which means that you can really deeply experience something, and then when it actually, the input stops, it lingers. Perhaps this example. How does that do, David? Now do you understand the nimitta? It's the afterglow.
So I have one question, Dhammarato, regarding
Yes.
this. So when we have something unwholesome, maybe some unwholesome episode, maybe a boss yell at me, and then I feel I have a bad feeling. And later on, when I am having a thought of that yelling, and then the bad feeling also comes up together with it.
Right, that's a nimitta, but it's not a wholesome nimitta.
The nimitta is anyway automatically, so that's why you say when you control your thoughts, so that will also take care of the nimitta. So nimitta is a feeling part.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's an actual feeling kind of a thought. And we can see that, in fact, those kind of things, when they're unwholesome, will drive our life. An example of that is that the child is trying to learn, let us say, to read. But the mind is wondering, they're not paying close attention. Somebody says, this is the word, and this is that word, and then we ask the child to repeat that word, and they forget. They have no nimitta. And so then the teacher will yell at the student, why don't you pay attention? And that yelling at the student does create a nimitta. And that, in fact, that nimitta of the bad feeling can actually interfere with that child learning to read. Because every time they start to learn to read, they get that feeling of getting yelled at. And so a lot of the nimittas that we have are, let us say, random, unwholesome, and keep us in an ordinary state. In fact, you could say that a disjointed or a non-samadhi mind is jumping from one nimitta to another, to another, to another, rather than being able to make them congruent so that you can keep the mind focused on just one nimitta. Does that help you understand that quality, David?
Yeah, so the nimitta is a mental sign or mental image. But
it can be an image, but it can also be a feeling. It can be actually any of the sensations. Here's an example of that. Do you remember what a rose smells like? You don't have to go get a rose. You remember what a rose smells like.
Sort of.
Sort of, right. Not very clear. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's another one about the bouquet of a wine. Can you actually detect and remember right now the difference between a white wine and a Bordeaux or a red wine? No, I'm sure that you cannot. But those people who can do that are the ones who practice it, experiment with it, and they become what you would call wine tasters, especially professional wine tasters, because they remember what the wine is supposed to taste like. And then the current wine that they have, they can say, yes, this is exactly the way I remember that it should taste. Right? So not all nimittas are visual.
Yes, although in the book I was reading from Buddhadasa, he mentioned the visual nimitta. It's like a sign in the mind that appears.
That would be the mandala, or that would be the kasina meditations. Here's an example. Do you know what a flame looks like? Can you remember a flame? For instance, you can remember the flame of a candle.
That's easy.
Okay. You can also remember the flame of, let us say, a campfire that you've been to. And so what the fire meditations would do then is to look at the candle and then close your eyes and re-examine that image in your mind, and then open your eyes again to check that what you remember of that flame is exactly what that flame looks like. And that's actually a skill to be developed. And it's especially valuable when you can distinguish between what's a wholesome thought and what's not a wholesome thought. Now, one of the things about smelling the roses or smelling the wine or doing the sand mandala is that those things get the mind congruent so that it's not scattered. In other words, the smell of a rose is so vague because it's got other things in there. When I ask you to remember the smell of a rose, I bet you had the image of a rose come up also. And the image of the rose prevented you from actually experiencing the smell of the rose. Okay, and when I mentioned about the wine tasting and the smelling of the bouquet, you know, that they run the glass around to get the air so that it'll bring that bouquet so they can smell that. But when I talk about it, you don't think about how the wine smells. You remember visually the glass of wine. That's being incongruent. And the congruency is to focus on the actual, like the monks are actually thinking about what the mandala looks like. Because if they start thinking about what the mandala smells like, or they don't like the guy who's helping them do the mandala or anything like that, then the mind will wander away, get scattered, and they'll make a mistake when they're doing the mandala. You could see that a nimitta is actually useful in mathematics so that you can remember numbers. Like, for instance, that you've got a PIN number and or maybe a telephone number, and somebody gives you the telephone number, you read the telephone number in the screen. Can you then set your telephone and actually key in all of the 7 or 8 or 9 digits Or do you have to keep going back because you can only remember 1 or 2 numbers at a time? So the development of being able to remember a long string of numbers then would be an ability of omnimata, the ability to remember. And what we really want to remember, the important thing that we want to remember is that everything is okay. Everything is fine. We want to remember that life is beautiful. We want to remember that we can come back to anapanasati, to remember to remove the unwholesome thoughts. So that too is a kind of a nimitta.
Dhammarato, I have a question now.
Mm-hmm.
So when we are having a wholesome thought, so then there is a good feeling in the body, right? And you would say this good feeling is a nimitta of this wholesome thought.
Okay, they're related.
Yeah, and then sometimes what can happen is you're having a wholesome thought, but still you don't feel so good, right? So you have to keep repeating this wholesome thought. So this means this is a nimitta of the past thought, which was not so wholesome, the bad feeling.
Well, it will pull you away from your objects, like the object of the breath, or the object of how you feel, the object of feeling safe and secure. Then, in fact, I think that you mentioned something about having a thought or a visual image of a bathtub, and now you want to go take a bath, as opposed to being safe, secure, satisfied, and comfortable right here, right now. And so most of the wandering mind is actually wandering around in various unimportant and, in fact, unwholesome nimittas, memories, visual images, and we have no control over that. So the real basic point is learning to develop the skill of choosing which nimitta you're going to have, and being able to control that. And so that's why it's a good practice to actually remember to look at what it feels like when you're going on an out-breath, so when the out-breath stops, you can continue to remember or continue to focus. Just like that example of what it feels like on the center of the hand. That in fact you do a lot of touching of your hands and you don't even pay attention to it. But now that I'm getting you to focus on remembering to feel what that feels like on the palm of the hand, so that when you take your finger away, you can still remember what it feels like. Even though the touch has gone away, you can still feel what that touch was. The same thing can be true with the out-breath, that you can remember to feel what the out-breath felt like when you were doing the out-breath. After the out-breath stops, you can still feel it. And I'm using that example because that's the example that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa is using. Does that clear it up, David, or does that give you more confusion?
Well, he mentioned there's actually an image in the mind when you pay attention to your breath long enough that will arise. It's not something you generate yourself. It's actually a real image that appears in the mind.
It can.
Yeah, this is what he was speaking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's well practiced. And being able to practice that means that you're not having a lot of unwholesome thoughts, that you're really closely paying attention.
Yeah, I don't ever get that.
All right. Actually, one of the things that we can say is that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa is used to talking to Thai people who really understand what he is talking about. But when Santikaro translates it, Santikaro really doesn't know what they were talking about, and so he does the best job he can to describe it in English. But the important thing is, can you keep the nimitta of having a wholesome mind? And you can develop that in many ways, and that's one of the examples that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa is using. So you might want to go back and reread what he said with the information that I've just given you, and it may give you some better understanding.
Okay, that's good.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, let's go ahead and finish now. Does anybody have any last remarks or last things to say about this?
One quick question, Dhammarato,
Pardon?
about the nimitta. I have one question about the nimitta. So sometime back, I was listening to your talk. This talk was about cessation.
Cessation.
And yes, and then I would say in the cessation you don't have a nimitta, is it? So nimitta also cease. So this is actually what is ceasing.
Actually, you could say that there is a nimitta, and the nimitta is the nimitta of cessation. In other words, imagine what it's like to be empty. How do you imagine being empty? What is the difference between being empty and imagining that you're empty? What kind of images do we have for sensation? What kind of images do we have for stopping?
I would say like deep sleep.
How about a blank or a black screen? A visually black nothingness. Okay, this would be a nimitta. All right, guys. Martin, do you have anything to say?
No, it was good. Thank you, Dhammarato. It was very great.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys later. Thank you for coming.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.